There's something strange about the way silence can fall between two people. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes, it's a quiet storm, roaring beneath the surface. That was exactly what happened that cold morning in Yosemite, when two best friends stood on the edge of a cliff, one of them seconds away from saying something that could destroy a 20-year friendship, the other just seconds away from walking away forever. No one talks about the moment before a relationship breaks. Everyone remembers the aftermath of fallout, the heartbreak, the silence. But the truth is, most relationships are lost not in the screaming, but in the silence that follows. In what isn't said. Adam and Sean weren't just any pair of hikers. They were brothers in everything but blood. They had survived childhood together in the suburbs of LA, held each other up through college, breakups, even the loss of Sean's mother. But here, under the towering sequoias, something fragile was snapping. It started with a name, Tyler, a mutual friend, a fallout, a betrayal, depending on who you asked. Sean brought it up, his voice tight, trembling with something deeper than anger. So, you're just gonna pretend none of that happened? Adam looked away. He heard every word, felt every accusation like a blade across the throat. But what he did next changed everything. He said nothing. The silence between them stretched for seconds, then a minute. Sean's fists clenched. Say something. Still nothing. To the outsider, Adam's silence looked like avoidance, but inside, it was war. He had words, harsh ones, true ones, but they didn't feel right. Not here, not like this. In that moment, something ancient came to him, not from a book, not from a quote, but from a place deeper than memory, a kind of discipline he had quietly trained in over the years, inspired by the Stoics he'd studied in secret. While others were busy shouting their opinions into the world, he remembered Epictetus's reminder, "We have two ears and one mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." So Adam listened, to the forest, to the breath between them, to the pain in Sean's voice. And in doing so, he did the hardest thing imaginable. He let the silence speak for him. Something shifted. Sean, expecting a fight, found none. The fuel he'd carried into the fire had nowhere to burn. He exhaled, shoulders dropping. The edge softened, and instead of escalating, he sat down on a rock, his voice quieter now. "You know, I thought you'd just lie, or make it worse." Adam sat beside him. Finally, he spoke, not to defend, not to win, just enough to let the truth in. "I'm not proud of what happened. But I didn't come here to win anything. I came to listen." That moment didn't just save a friendship, it reshaped it. It taught both of them that sometimes, words are not the answer. That silence isn't cowardice, wisdom in disguise. You see, silence isn't empty. It's full of power. In a world addicted to noise, outrage, and fast replies, the one who pauses, the one who chooses not to react, becomes dangerous, stoic, free. That morning in Yosemite wasn't just a hike, it was a lesson. Not every fire must be fought with fire. Some must be met with stillness. This is just the beginning of their story. If you want to hear how this moment changed the course of their friendship and the powerful Stoic truths that helped them rebuild, make sure to subscribe. Supporting this channel means we get to keep making videos that move you, challenge you, and help you grow. Now, let's see who's really been paying attention when faced with an emotionally charged conflict. What's your instinct? A. Speak your truth immediately, no matter how raw it feels. B. Pause, breathe, and wait before deciding to respond. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why. Let's learn from each other. Michelle hadn't seen her father in 5 years. Not since the day she walked out of their small Michigan home. Her car packed with everything she owned, and her heart still raw from the words they'd exchanged. He had called her foolish for walking away from the family business, insisting She was throwing away a future of stability and legacy. But Michelle had wanted something else. She wanted to become a nurse, to make her own way. And when she made that choice, the silence between them grew thicker than any argument ever could. Now she sat across from him in a quiet diner just off Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. The windows fogged with early morning dew, the hum of coffee, machines and murmurs of strangers surrounding them like white noise. She had called him last week. Just one sentence. "I'd like to talk." He had said yes. That surprised her. His face had aged. More lines around the eyes. Shoulders slumped. A bit more than she remembered. But his hands were still strong, still calloused from decades of work. Still holding his coffee cup like it was something that anchored him. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't going to be easy. The past wasn't something you could sweep aside with a polite smile. But she wasn't here to argue or to win. She had something else in mind. Something she'd been practicing in the silence of her apartment, after night shifts at the hospital. She was here to speak from the soul, not the scar. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling, "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds. I just wanted you to know who I've become, and I hope you'll let me tell you." He didn't interrupt, just nodded once. She talked about what nursing had taught her, holding hands of strangers during their last breaths, watching mothers cry in hallways, cleaning wounds that medicine couldn't touch. She spoke about fear, about the nights she'd come home and sat in silence, wondering if he was right all along, wondering if she'd chosen the harder path for no reason at all. But then she told him something else, something softer. She told him how she had remembered his work ethic while holding her first patients, and how she had drawn strength from the way he never gave up, even when the family business nearly went under. How even in their silence, she never stopped needing his approval, never stopped loving him. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, he whispered, "I thought you hated me." It broke her. All these years, both had been carrying stories about the other, stories filled with assumptions, pain, pride, and neither had spoken them aloud, until now. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Michelle had waited 5 years to speak her truth, not because she hadn't had the words, but because she needed time to make sure those words would come from clarity, not bitterness. That morning, in the quiet hum of a Chicago diner, her words didn't just fill the space between them, they began to heal it. Stoicism isn't about emotional suppression. It's about emotional precision. Speaking only what is necessary. Speaking only what is true. For Michelle, speaking wasn't about defending her decisions. It was about inviting her father into her reality with compassion, not conviction. And, for him, listening wasn't an act of surrender. It was an act of courage. By the end of breakfast, they hadn't solved everything. Old wounds don't vanish in an hour. But they had started something new, understanding. It was raw, fragile, but it was real. That is the hidden power of words when used with intention. They don't need to be grand to be transformative. Sometimes, a single sentence spoken honestly and without ego can begin to repair years of silence. If you've ever avoided a conversation because you feared what might surface, ask yourself this: what might happen if, instead of speaking to be right, you spoke to be real? What if your words weren't weapons, but bridges? Michelle walked out of that diner with no guarantees, but she left with her father's voice in her ears, saying, "I'm proud of you." And that, after everything, was enough to begin again. Louis had always believed that hard work and talent would speak for themselves. He graduated top of his class from a state university, built a portfolio that landed him a role at one of the fastest growing tech startups in New York, and arrived on his first day eager, ambitious, and ready to contribute. But nothing prepared him for what that office would do to his spirit. The signs were subtle at first. a snide comment about his accent in a meeting, a joke about his background that lingered too long. When he offered an idea, it was brushed aside to be praised later when someone else repeated it. He told himself not to take it personally. Everyone was stressed. Startups moved fast. People said things, but over time, the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't just workplace stress. It was a culture that quietly excluded him, that measured him against an invisible standard he hadn't agreed to. Still, Luis kept showing up, on time, well-dressed, prepared, but each day he felt a little more invisible. He found a strange kind of refuge during his lunch breaks. Instead of eating with co-workers, he'd take a short walk to Central Park, find the same bench near the lake, and open his notebook. At first he wrote just to vent, but soon the words took on shape. Questions, quotes, observations. It became a ritual, a quiet rebellion against the noise. One quote from Seneca stood out. "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor." Luis read it again and again. In an environment where everyone seemed to chase validation, status, and dominance, that one sentence reminded him of a different kind of power. The power of not needing to win someone else's game. He began to change not his work ethic, but his mindset. Instead of reacting to every insult, he observed. Instead of defending himself at every turn, he documented. Instead of seeking approval, he focused on mastery. His silence was no longer the silence of fear, it became the silence of strategy. And yet, Stoicism isn't about inaction. It's about discernment. There came a day when Luis could no longer remain quiet. A younger colleague, new, nervous, and bright, was being publicly mocked during a team meeting for a mistake she'd made. The room laughed. The manager didn't step in. Luis did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack. He simply said, "Everyone in this room has made a mistake, and none of us learned anything by being humiliated for it." Silence followed. This time, not the kind that crushed, but the kind that demanded reflection. After that meeting, something shifted. Not overnight, not dramatically, but subtly. People paid more attention when Luis spoke. The manager scheduled a one-on-one. The younger colleagues sent him a quiet thank you message. He hadn't intended to be a hero. He had simply acted in alignment with his values. Luis realized that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers from the inside and asks, "Who do you choose to be today?" Modern Stoicism is not about enduring abuse in silence. It's about holding your dignity when the world tries to strip it away. It's about responding with principle when others respond with pettiness. It's about choosing your timing not out of fear, but from wisdom. Luis continued journaling in Central Park, but now, his words were less about survival and more about meaning. He wrote about the kind of leader he hoped to become, about the company culture he'd build if given the chance, about how he learned to speak, not always with words, but with action, patience, and quiet integrity. In time, he did leave that company. He found another role, one where he felt seen, respected. But he carried with him the deepest lesson from that season of inner war, that silence, when used with intention, can be a weapon of grace. And that speaking, when anchored in purpose, can shift the course of a room, a company, a life. The Stoics never promised comfort, but they promised clarity. Luis found his not in a louder voice, but in a stronger presence. Emily sat beneath the moss-draped oaks of Forsyth Park, the final divorce papers folded in her lap like a quiet ending no one clapped for. The air in Savannah was thick with humidity and memory. It wasn't the kind of moment people post about or turn into some brave, triumphant story. It was the quiet kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't shatter like glass, but erodes you, slowly, gently, until one day you realize you've let go of someone you never thought you'd lose. Across from her sat the man she had once called her husband. His name still sat in the back of her throat like a habit. She hadn't seen him in months, hadn't spoken outside of logistics and signatures, But today, they had agreed to meet. Not to fix what was broken, just to close the chapter. In person, with dignity, maybe even with love. For days, Emily had rehearsed what she might say. She had rewritten imaginary conversations in her head, like scripts she never got to act out. But when she saw him sitting there with that same crooked posture and familiar, quiet, her mind went blank. All the arguments, all the wounds, suddenly felt distant. What rose in her chest instead was something else. The simple ache of goodbye. She broke the silence first. "I'm not here to rehash everything. I think we've both had enough of that." He nodded, eyes downcast. I think we owe it to each other to speak, not from the version of us that hurt each other, but from the version that once said, "I love you," and meant it. The words landed softly, but with weight. He looked up, and for the first time in years, there was no defense in his eyes, just sadness. Maybe even understanding. Emily had spent the last few months trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. Therapy, journaling, late night, walks through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, and somewhere along the way, she stumbled upon a line from Marcus Aurelius. "Accept whatever comes to you, woven in the pattern of your destiny, for what could more aptly fit your needs." It didn't comfort her at first. The idea of loving your fate, of embracing even this heartbreak as something necessary, felt cruel. But slowly, it began to make sense. She hadn't failed. He hadn't either. They had simply reached the end of what their love could carry. The Stoics never promised eternal happiness. They promised clarity. And she had found hers, not in blaming him, but in forgiving both of them. "I loved you," she said, "and I still do, in a way. Just differently now. I think part of me always will." He looked like he wanted to speak, but didn't know how. She didn't need him to. This wasn't about closure in the dramatic sense. It wasn't a final act with a perfect script. It was about choosing to release each other with grace, without bitterness, without rewriting history into something uglier than it had been. They talked for a while, about the dog they once had, about a beach trip years ago, about how, despite everything, they had made each other better in some small way. It didn't erase the pain, but it made it bearable. As they stood to leave, Emily felt the sting of tears, but she let them come, not as weakness, but as truth. Emotions didn't make her less stoic, they made her human. The Stoics had never asked her to numb herself, only to master herself. And in this moment, she felt stronger than she ever had, while holding it all in. She extended her hand. "Take care of yourself." He took it, squeezed it lightly. "You too." And that was it. No grand reconciliation, no cinematic ending. Just two people choosing to part ways, not in rage, but in remembrance of who they once were. As she walked away, Emily didn't feel empty. She felt full with memory, with growth, with the quiet pride of someone who had walked through fire and come out softer, not colder. That night, she wrote herself a letter. Not to him, not to explain, just to say, "You did your best." And that was enough. That's what Stoicism had given her, not a way to avoid pain, but a way to honor it, to learn from it. To learn from it, and to speak, not to change the past, but to free the future. Coach Thompson had seen a lot in his 2 decades leading the high school basketball team in Seattle. Wins, losses, broken bones, broken hearts. He knew the game stretched far beyond the court, but nothing quite prepared him for the moment. Devin walked into the gym that Tuesday morning, face lowered, shoulders slumped, his usual spark extinguished. There were whispers already, something about a fight off campus, a suspension hanging in the air, a video circulating online. Thompson hadn't watched it. He didn't need to. He could see enough in Devin's eyes to know the boy was unraveling. Other coaches might have jumped into lecture mode, stern warnings, threats, guilt. But Thompson did something unexpected. He said nothing. He motioned to the bench. Devin sat. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Thompson had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is space. Not space to escape responsibility, but space to gather themselves without fear of immediate judgment. Devin finally spoke. His voice cracked with shame. "I messed up, coach." Thompson nodded, still quiet. He could have said a dozen things in that moment. About consequences, about expectations, about how this could ruin his season, his college chances. But he didn't. Instead, he waited. And Devin kept talking. About the pressure, the anger, the feeling of never being good enough, not just as an athlete, but as a person. About his dad, who hadn't been home in weeks. About how the fight wasn't really about the guy at the party, it was about something deeper. Boiling for years. When Devin finished, he looked up, half expecting the old coach to be disappointed. But all he saw was stillness, steady eyes, a man who hadn't flinched once during the storm. Finally, Thompson spoke. Sometimes the loudest moments in your life will ask you to be quiet. Not because you don't care, but because that's when you start hearing what really matters. It wasn't a lecture. It was a lifeline. Thompson believed in discipline, yes, but more than that, he believed in presence. In showing up with your full self when someone is at their lowest. He had learned from years of watching young men flail under the weight of silent battles that words often failed where empathy succeeded. There's a quote by Epictetus that lived on a small card in his office. "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." Thompson had never spoken much about his beliefs, but his team knew. He led with patience, with focus, with integrity. He didn't just coach basketball, he modeled calm under pressure, self-control in chaos. He had once lost a son, years ago, to addiction. It changed him. He never talked about it, but it lived in his silences and the way he listened more than he spoke. Especially when a kid came to him hurt or scared, or on the edge of losing themselves. In the days that followed, Devin faced the consequences. He sat out games. He apologized. He did community service. But he never slipped again. Not because he was afraid of punishment, but because he had felt, for the first time in a long time, what it meant to be seen without being shamed. Thompson didn't need recognition. He didn't need his team to call him wise. What he needed, what he believed in, was giving young men the chance to rebuild from their own ashes. And that's what Stoicism, in its truest form, offers. Not detachment, but discernment. The wisdom to know when to speak, when to wait, when to simply be a steady presence for someone who's learning how to stand again. Years later, Devin would send him a letter from college. In it, he wrote, "You were the first man who didn't yell when I broke. You just sat with me. And somehow, that helped me put myself back together." Thompson never framed the letter, never showed it off. But he kept it in the top drawer of his desk, folded carefully. A quiet reminder that's chosen with care, not the absence of love. Sometimes, it's the deepest form of it. In a quiet home just outside Boston, Grandma Irene sat in her favorite armchair, the afternoon light spilling across the hardwood floor like warm memory. Her hands, delicate but steady, held her phone close as she began recording. The screen showed a blinking red dot, but she didn't look at it. Her eyes were focused somewhere beyond the present and the future, on someone she would never meet in person. "Hi, sweetheart," she began, her voice gentle, but filled with something more powerful than timid. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm not around anymore. But I want you to know some things I've learned, the hard way." She paused for a moment, gathering her breath, her thoughts. She wasn't reading from a script. These words came from her life, unfiltered, unfinished, but undeniably true. Irene had grown up in a world that demanded silence from women like her. She had been taught to hold things in, to endure rather than express, to sacrifice without speaking of the cost. But age, and loss, and love had given her something else. clarity, and now, at the edge of her life, she felt a deep responsibility to speak, not to control the narrative, but to pass on the torch. "I want to tell you about mistakes," she continued, "because I made plenty, and regrets, they don't go away. You just learn to carry them without letting them own you." She spoke of the man she loved and lost, the children she raised, the nights she spent wondering if she'd ever done enough. She talked about faith and fear, about how sometimes the right decision doesn't feel good until years later, about how some of the best things in life are quiet, ordinary moments, the smell of bread baking, the laughter of a child, the stillness of early morning. And then she said something that would live long after the recording stopped. "Speak your truth, not for applause, but because silence, left unchecked, becomes regret. And when you speak, do it with kindness. The world doesn't need more noise, it needs more soul." She had learned that from the Stoics, though she didn't call herself one. But she'd read Marcus Aurelius in her 60s, during a time of profound loneliness. "You could leave life right now," he had written. "Let that determine what you do and say and think." It wasn't morbid to her. It was liberating. It made every word count. This voice memo was her way of honoring that truth. A conversation meant not for the living room, but for the future. For the granddaughter she wouldn't see grow up. For the young woman who would one day feel lost, or afraid, or unsure of what came next and might stumble upon this message. Like a light in the dark, digital legacies are strange. You don't always know who will hear them, or when, or how your voice will echo through someone else's silence. But Irene wasn't trying to be timeless. She was trying to be honest. She spoke about love, about how it's never perfect, but always worth the risk. About how forgiveness doesn't mean you forget it, means you choose peace over poison. About how grief is not a flaw to fix, but a sign that something mattered deeply. And most of all, she spoke about time. "It slips through your hands faster than you think," she whispered, "so don't waste it on resentment. Don't hold back the words you'll wish you'd said. Speak now, even if your voice shakes." As the recording ended, Irene sat in silence for a long while. Not out of sadness, but reverence. She had said what needed saying. Her part was done. The Stoics taught that death wasn't something to fear, but something to remember. Memento mori not as a threat, but as a call to live fully, honestly, and deliberately. And in her final years, Irene chose to speak to the future with that same spirit, not loudly, not perfectly, but with love. Some conversations don't end. They just change form. They become echoes, footprints, whispers across generations. And if someone, somewhere, hears them when they need it most, then the words were never wasted. They were eternal. In the quiet spaces between words, and in the deliberate pauses that held more power than 100 sentences. Each of our 6 characters made a choice, sometimes to speak, sometimes to remain silent, but always from a place of intention. When we step back and look at the whole arc of their stories, a greater truth unfolds, that navigating life's most difficult conversations isn't about always having the right words, but about having the right heart behind them. Adam's silence on the cliffs of Yosemite wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. In a moment where ego begged for defense, he chose peace. He showed us that not every fire needs fuel, and that sometimes restraint is the greatest form of love. Michelle, in the heart of Chicago, chose to break a 5-year silence with her father, not to win an argument, but to build a bridge. Her story reminds us that words can heal, but only when they're rooted in clarity and grace. Luis faced the daily battles of a toxic workplace in New York, where microaggressions and quiet exclusions tested his character. Instead of exploding, he observed, he reflected, and when the moment was right, he spoke not to impress, but to uplift. He proved that dignity, when protected in silence, becomes strength when finally spoken. In Savannah, Emily confronted the grief of a fading marriage. She didn't scream, accuse, or collapse into blame. She spoke softly, but with complete honesty, and offered her former husband a rare kind of closure, kind rooted in compassion, not judgment. Her choice to speak from her healed self, not her hurt self, transformed her pain into purpose. Coach Thompson, in Seattle, met a struggling teenager not with lectures, but with stillness. His silence was not avoidance. It was a deep form of presence. He reminded us that sometimes the loudest love is the one that doesn't interrupt, doesn't instruct, but simply stays. Devin didn't need a sermon. He needed someone to believe he could rebuild, and Thompson's quiet belief was louder than any words ever could be. And finally, Grandma Irene in Boston left behind a voice, not for applause, but for impact. Her message to a granddaughter she'd never meet was more than a recording. It was a legacy, a reminder that our words can outlive us, but only if we speak them with soul. Together, these stories paint a portrait of Stoic wisdom in motion, not as theory, but as lived experience. They show us that knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is not just a communication skill, it's a philosophy, a way of life. So what's the lesson? In a world that rewards hot takes, fast replies, and louder opinions, these 6 lives invite us to slow down, to listen before reacting, to pause before pressing send, to ask, is what I'm about to say necessary? Is it kind? Will it build something or just burn something down? And perhaps more importantly, they ask us to examine the motives behind our silence. Are we quiet out of fear or out of intention? Are we withholding truth, holding space for something greater to emerge? Applying this wisdom today doesn't require dramatic moments or life-altering decisions. It starts with small choices. The decision not to clap back at a passive-aggressive comment, the courage to speak up when someone else is being silenced, the humility to say I was wrong, the compassion to say I understand. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. Because in that presence, in those moments where you choose awareness over impulse, you become someone who not only navigates conflict with clarity, but who leads others toward peace. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Which part of the story resonated most deeply with you? Was it Adam's quiet strength, Michelle's vulnerable honesty, Luce's resilience, Emily's grace, Coach Thompson's presence, or Irene's timeless voice? Comment below and let us know. When was a time in your life you chose to speak or stay silent and it changed everything? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this video moved you, inspired you, or made you think in a new way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us grow this community and continue sharing meaningful, soulful content that brings wisdom into the real world. Your voice matters. Your silence does too. Let's keep learning together.